He thought a simple act of kindness would be the end of it, a single piece of bread for a ghost of a girl found at the edge of his world. But by sundown, that world had shrunk to the size of his cabin, surrounded by a silence more terrifying than any war cry. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The land was a harsh confessor, and Elias was its most devout parishioner. Every day for 10 years he had offered it the sweat from his brow and the ache in his bones, and in return, it had given him only enough to persist, never enough to prosper. His homestead was a scar on an unforgiving landscape of rock and wind-bitten pine, a testament to a stubbornness that looked a lot like penance. The silence was his constant companion, a heavy blanket he pulled over the memories that screamed in the quiet of his own mind. He had come here to forget a life he had fractured, to bury a man he no longer recognized under calluses and exhaustion. His routine was a prayer against chaos: chop wood, tend the meager garden, mend the fence, stare into the fire until the flames blurred into the faces he was trying to outrun. Then she appeared. She was less a person and more a suggestion of one, a flicker in the periphery where the forest met his cleared land. Her frame was a brittle collection of sticks draped in deerskin, her hair a matted tangle of black river weed, and her eyes, two vast and hollow pools of hunger. They held a depth of suffering that Elias recognized with a jolt, a familiar darkness that echoed in the empty chambers of his own soul. He froze, his hand on the axe handle, every instinct screaming danger. She was a stray, a wild thing, a prelude to trouble he had spent a decade avoiding. The world beyond his fence was not his concern. That was the contract he'd made with his own survival. He should have raised the axe, not as a weapon, but as a warning. He should have shouted, sent her scurrying back into the shadows she'd emerged from. He did neither. He saw the tremor in her thin arms, the way her gaze was fixed not on him, but on the half-eaten loaf of bread resting on the tree stump he used as a table. It was a look that bypassed prejudice, that spoke a universal language of need he had once chosen to ignore, with devastating consequences. He remembered another face, another pair of desperate eyes, a choice made in a moment of fear that had cost him everything. The memory was a hot brand against his conscience. Without a word, without conscious thought, he broke the bread in two. He set the larger piece on the edge of the stump, a silent offering, then retreated slowly, deliberately, toward the safety of his cabin, his back rigid. He did not look back until the heavy oak door was shut behind him. Peering through a grimy pane of glass, he watched her move. She crept forward with the caution of a starved wolf, snatched the bread, and vanished back into the trees as silently as she had come. The forest swallowed her whole, leaving only the oppressive silence, now charged with a new and terrible weight. Elias stood there for a long time, the bread in his hand growing stale, a profound and unwelcome feeling stirring within him. It felt like the first tremor of an earthquake, the sign that the ground he had so carefully settled was about to break apart beneath his feet. The following day dawned cold and gray, the sky a sheet of unpolished pewter. Elias moved through his morning chores with a strained, mechanical precision, but his focus was fractured. His eyes kept drifting to the tree line, scanning the deep, inscrutable shadows for a sign of movement. The silence of the woods felt different now. It was no longer a passive, empty quiet. It was an observant one, a held breath. He felt watched. The image of the girl was seared into his mind, the hollow cheeks, the desperate, consuming hunger in her eyes. It was a ghost that his own ghosts had risen to greet. He found himself pausing mid-swing of his axe, listening, waiting for the snap of a twig that wasn't of his own making. The world had become a place of unsettling potential. He spent the afternoon reinforcing things that didn't need reinforcing. He checked the latch on his door, already solid oak and iron. He walked the perimeter of his fence line, tamping down posts that were firm in the earth, his gaze sweeping the impassive pines. It was a fool's errand, an attempt to impose order on a fear that was formless and internal. He was building a fortress not against an intruder, but against the consequences of his own compassion, an emotion he thought he had successfully starved out of himself years ago. A memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass, surfaced. A woman's face, pale in the moonlight, her voice a desperate whisper at a door he had kept bolted. "Please," she had begged. "My boy is sick." Just a little water, some medicine. He had been afraid then, too. Afraid of the sickness she might carry. Afraid of the soldiers who patrolled the night. Afraid of the trouble that clung to the needy like a shroud. He had kept the door locked. He had listened to her pleas fade into weeping, and then into a silence that had haunted him across a continent. He shook his head, trying to banish the thought. This was different. This was a wild girl in a wild land. It meant nothing. By evening, a part of him had nearly convinced himself he had imagined it all, that the gnawing loneliness of his self-imposed exile had finally conjured a phantom from his own guilt. He ate his meal of salted pork and beans, the food tasting like ash in his mouth. He looked at the remaining portion of the bread loaf on his table, a stark reminder. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the clouds in bruised shades of purple and orange, he glanced out the window one last time before barring the door for the night. And that's when he saw them. They were not a war party. There were no painted faces, no brandished weapons, no cries of anger. They were simply there. Figures, dozens of them, emerging from the woods to stand in a resolute, unwavering line just beyond his fence. They stood as still as the ancient pines behind them, their forms becoming dark, solemn silhouettes against the dying light. They did not approach. They did not speak. They just watched his cabin, their collective presence a suffocating weight, their silence 1,000 times more menacing than any threat he could have imagined. The first hour was the worst. It was an hour stretched thin, pulled taut like a bowstring until Elias felt his own nerves might snap. He stood in the gloom of his cabin, his knuckles white around the stock of his rifle, watching the unmoving shapes that had materialized at the edge of his life. The sun sank completely, and the world was plunged into a deep, starless dark, but he knew they were still there. He could feel their presence, a pressure against the thin wooden walls of his home. It was a siege of the soul. His mind, a frantic animal in a cage, raced through every possibility. It was a trap. The girl was bait, a deliberate lure to test his defenses or his compassion. Now her family, her tribe, had come to exact a price for his land, his supplies, his life. Every story he'd ever heard from fearful settlers in the distant town, tales of raids and violence swirled in his head, feeding a terror that was cold and absolute. He was a fool, a soft-hearted, sentimental fool who had let a decade of vigilance be undone by a moment of pity for a starving child. The irony was a bitter pill. The one act of grace he had performed in years had brought a silent army to his door. He paced the length of his small cabin, a 2-room box that now felt like a tomb. From the front window to the back, he saw the same thing, the impenetrable wall of the forest and the stoic, silent figures guarding the space in between. They had him surrounded. There was no escape. He thought of riding for help, but the nearest settlement was a day's ride away, and he would never make it past the line of watchers. He was utterly, completely alone, just as he had always wanted to be, and now he understood what a curse that truly was. He decided to ride out to the town anyway, just to gauge their reaction and seek some counsel, however futile. As he saddled his horse in the dim light of dawn, he felt their eyes on him, but no one made a move to stop him. The ride was tense, every shadow seeming to hold a threat. When he arrived, the town sheriff, a portly man named Abernathy with a face permanently soured by suspicion, listened to his story with a distinct lack of sympathy. "You fed one of them?" Abernathy grunted, polishing a tarnished badge on his shirt. "On your land?" He shook his head, not in pity but in disgust. "Well, Elias, sounds like you invited the wolves to your door. You don't give them things. It shows weakness. They see you have something to spare, they'll come back for the rest." The sheriff's advice was simple and brutal. Go home, bar your door, and if they step 1 foot over that fence, you shoot. Don't hesitate. It's your land, or it won't be for long. The words offered no comfort, only a stark confirmation of his isolation. He was on his own, his fate a private matter between him and the silent figures who waited for him back home. As he rode back, the heavy judgment of the town behind him and the silent judgment of the tribe ahead, Elias felt a profound sense of despair. He was a man caught between 2 worlds, belonging to neither, understood by none. The silence that awaited him was no longer just a threat. It was his sentence. The second day of the silent vigil bled into a third, and Elias's world shrank to the confines of his own escalating dread. The figures remained. They were as constant as the sun's arc across the sky, their stillness a monumental act of patience that frayed his sanity. He began to see them not as individual people, but as a single, cohesive entity, a living wall of judgment. From his window, he watched them. They did not build fires, they did not speak to one another. They simply stood or sat, their gazes fixed on his cabin, their presence a relentless, psychological pressure. The silence was a language he couldn't comprehend, and his mind filled the void with his darkest fears. Every creak of the floorboards was an approaching footstep. Every gust of wind rattling the window pane was a prelude to an attack. Sleep offered no escape, only fractured nightmares from which he would wake with a gasp, his heart hammering against his ribs, convinced the door had been breached. He would scramble for his rifle only to find the cabin empty and the silence outside, intact and waiting. He started talking to himself, his voice a rough, jarring sound in the oppressive quiet. "What do you want?" he'd whisper to the unseeing windows. "Why are you just standing there?" The questions were swallowed by the silence, unanswered. He wrestled with the sheriff's words, with the ingrained prejudices of his time. They were savages, everyone said, unpredictable, violent. Yet their behavior defied that stereotype. If they wanted his life or his supplies, why this prolonged, unnerving watch? A raid would have been swift, brutal, and over by now. This was something else, something more complex and terrifying in its ambiguity. This was a reckoning. His past continued to bleed into his present. The memory of the woman at his door became more vivid, more damning. He could almost hear her boy's ragged cough, a sound he had tried so hard to ignore. He remembered his own justification. "It's not my fight. I have to protect what's mine." He saw now how hollow that reasoning was, a flimsy shield for his own cowardice. He had defined his world by a fence line, by a locked door, believing he could keep the suffering of others out. But suffering had a way of seeping through the cracks. It had found him then, and it had found him now. The girl's face superimposed itself over the memory of the woman. 2 instances of need, 2 moments of decision. The first, a failure that had set the course for his desolate life. The second, an act of simple humanity that had led to this silent siege. Was he being punished for his past sin or his present transgression? The uncertainty was a torment. He was a man suspended between 2 guilts, and the silence of the tribe was the silence of a jury that had already reached its verdict. He was alone with his thoughts, and they were merciless. The land that had been his refuge had become his prison, and the quiet he had sought had become his accuser. He was being unmade, stripped down to the raw, fearful man he had been a decade ago, before he had built this fortress of solitude around his broken heart. On the morning of the 4th day, there was a change. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it shifted the very atmosphere of the standoff. The air grew still. The perpetual wind that scoured the plains seemed to hold its breath. Elias, peering from his usual vantage point at the window, felt it before he saw it. One of the figures detached itself from the line. It was an old man, his face a testament to seasons of hardship and wisdom, his long gray hair tied back with a simple leather thong. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that held no trace of aggression. He took a single, measured step forward, crossing an invisible boundary that had been respected for 3 days. Then he stopped, his feet planted firmly on the hard-packed earth just a few yards from Elias's fence. He did not look at the cabin. Instead, his gaze was directed toward the ground in front of him. This one small movement sent a cascade of panic through Elias. This was it, the prelude, the signal for the attack. His hands, slick with sweat, fumbled for his rifle. He raised it to his shoulder, the cold metal of familiar and grim comfort. He centered the sight on the old man's chest, his finger hovering over the trigger. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. The sheriff's voice echoed in his mind. "If they step 1 foot over that fence, you shoot. Don't hesitate." The old man was not over the fence, not yet, but he had breached the established order. It was a challenge, a question posed across the charged space between them. Elias's entire being screamed at him to fire, to end the suspense, to reclaim control through a definitive act of violence. But he didn't. His finger remained frozen. He looked at the old man who stood with a stillness that was not threatening, but profound. It was the stillness of a mountain, of an ancient tree. There was a power in it that a bullet could not touch. Elias lowered the rifle by a fraction, his breathing ragged. This inaction was a moment of profound significance. For the first time, he was not reacting with the frantic fear that had governed his life. He was waiting. He was observing. He was allowing for a possibility other than the worst-case scenario his terror had scripted. A tiny, fragile seed of curiosity pushed through the hard soil of his fear. Why? Why this single step? Why this man? What was the meaning of this silent, patient theater? It was not a declaration of war. It felt like something else entirely. A summons, perhaps, or an invitation. The old man remained perfectly still, a statue of intent. The rest of the tribe watched, their silence as deep and unreadable as ever. The moment stretched on, thick with unspoken meaning. Elias stood at his window, rifle in hand but not in aim. His own fear and the old man's stillness locked in a silent duel. In that moment, he ceased to be a man merely hiding from his past. He had become an active participant in his present, a man forced to confront a mystery that was far more complex than a simple matter of survival. The question was no longer just what they wanted from him, but what this moment required of him. The standoff, this silent war of nerves, continued for 2 more days. The old man remained in his advanced position, a fixed point in a world of uncertainty. But the logistics of survival are unforgiving, and they do not respect the subtleties of psychological warfare. Elias's water barrel was running low. The pile of firewood he'd stacked against the cabin wall had dwindled to a few meager logs. These were the simple, brutal facts of his existence, and they now forced his hand. He could not remain barricaded in his cabin forever. To survive, he had to go outside. He had to walk past the silent watchers. The decision gnawed at him through a sleepless night. The morning brought no new clarity, only the pressing reality of thirst. His throat was dry, his lips chapped. Taking his rifle in one hand and 2 empty buckets in the other, he unbarred the door. The sound of the heavy bolt sliding back was unnaturally loud, a crack of thunder in the profound quiet. He stepped onto his porch, and the world seemed to stop. Every eye was on him. He could feel their collective gaze as a physical weight, pressing on his skin, raising the hairs on his arms. He stood there for a long moment, his heart a wild bird battering itself against the cage of his ribs. He forced his legs to move. Down the 3 steps of the porch, the crunch of his boots on the dry, dusty ground sounded like an explosion. He did not look at the line of figures. He kept his eyes fixed on his destination, the well, which stood 100 feet from his cabin, halfway between his home and the fence line where they waited. The walk was the longest of his life. Every instinct screamed at him to turn and run, to barricade himself back inside his wooden shell. He felt impossibly exposed, a lone animal crossing a wide, open plain under the watchful eyes of a patient pride of lions. He could hear his own ragged breathing, the frantic thump of his own blood in his ears. He half expected an arrow in his back, the sudden sharp cry of an attack, but nothing came. There was only the sun on his neck, the dust in his nostrils, and the crushing, observant silence. He reached the well, his movements stiff and clumsy. He lowered a bucket, the rope squeaking in protest. The sound of the bucket hitting the water far below was a relief, a small, familiar noise in this alien landscape of quiet tension. He drew the water, his muscles straining, never once taking his eyes off the ground in front of him. He filled both buckets, the sloshing of the water a comforting sound. Then came the return journey. He turned, forcing himself to walk slowly, not to run. He could feel their eyes on his back, a prickling sensation that was both terrifying and strangely intimate. He reached the porch, climbed the steps, and slipped back inside the cabin, barring the door behind him. He leaned against it, his body trembling, the buckets of water sloshing onto the floor. He was alive, unharmed. He had walked through the valley of the shadow, and nothing had happened. The mystery, which had been a source of terror, now deepened into something else, something that bordered on awe. They had let him pass. They had the power to stop him, to end him, and they had chosen not to. The silence was not the prelude to an attack. It was something else. And for the first time, Elias began to suspect that the fear he was feeling was entirely his own creation. The cool water from the well did little to quench the fire of memory that now burned unchecked in Elias's mind. The tribe's incomprehensible passivity had unlocked something deep within him, a sealed chamber of guilt he had guarded for a decade. As he sat at his small table, the silence outside pressing in, the past rose not as a fleeting specter, but as a fully formed reality, demanding to be witnessed. He wasn't a soldier, not in the traditional sense. He had been a man of medicine, a doctor in a city choking on the yellow fever. He had come from a world of science and reason, a world that crumbled into superstition and terror as the pestilence spread. The memory was a sensory assault, the cloying smell of sickness and carbolic acid, the constant mournful tolling of church bells, the waxy yellow pallor of the dying. He had worked until his hands were raw, until his mind was a blur of exhaustion and grief, watching his learning and his remedies prove useless against the inexorable tide of death. Then came the night that redefined him. The quarantine had been absolute. The city guard, their faces masked with vinegar-soaked rags, patrolled the streets with orders to let no one pass, to contain the sickness at all costs. His own wife, Eleanor, had fallen ill. He had exhausted his own supplies, his own knowledge. He knew of another doctor, a man on the other side of the city who had been experimenting with a new treatment, a desperate rumor of hope. In the dead of night, he had tried to move her. He had wrapped her in blankets, her body burning with fever, and attempted to steal through the deserted streets. He was no soldier, but that night he became a fugitive. They were stopped at a barricade. A young corporal, his face barely visible in the lantern light, his eyes wide with fear. Elias pleaded. He explained he was a doctor, that his wife was dying. He begged for passage, for a sliver of mercy in a merciless world. The corporal, a boy no older than 20, was resolute. His orders were clear. The fear in the boy's eyes was a mirror of the city's panic. He saw not a husband trying to save his wife, but a carrier of the plague trying to breach the walls, to spread the contagion. He was the enemy. Then the woman from the memory, the one who had come to his door days earlier, appeared at the barricade, her own sick child in her arms. She too pleaded with the guard. In that moment of shared desperation, Elias made his choice. He used the woman's frantic plea as a distraction. While the guard's attention was on her, Elias made a run for it, darting into a dark alley, leaving her to face the corporal's fear and frustration alone. He heard her cry out as he fled. He didn't look back. He ran, driven by the selfish singular goal of saving his own. It was for nothing. He never found the other doctor. Eleanor died in that dark alley, her last breath a faint whisper against his cheek. He had failed her. And he had abandoned the other woman and her child to an unknown fate, sacrificing their desperation for his own futile hope. He had broken his oath as a doctor and his integrity as a man. The silence he had sought out here, on this desolate prairie, was not for peace. It was a self-imposed quarantine of the soul. He had locked himself away, convinced he was a contagion of failure and cowardice, a man who deserved to be alone so he could cause no more harm. Now, another silent group stood at his border, their presence dredging up this monumental failure. He looked out the window at the unmoving figures and understood. This wasn't a siege. It was a mirror. A new dawn broke, and with it came a fragile clarity. The terror that had coiled in Elias's gut for days had receded, replaced by a profound, aching sense of resignation. He was done running. The past had caught him, and he would face its judgment, whatever form it took. The old man was still there, a silent sentinel at the edge of his property. Elias watched him for a long time, not with fear, but with a weary curiosity. Then, the old man moved again. He bent down with the slow, deliberate grace of age and placed a small, dark bundle on the ground just on his side of the fence line. He straightened up, gave the bundle a single long look, and then retreated, stepping back to rejoin the silent line of his people. The bundle sat alone in the dust, a stark and potent question mark. Elias's first instinct was suspicion. It was a trap, a trick, but the fear felt hollow now, a well-worn habit rather than a genuine conviction. His deeper, more honest self knew this was something else. This was the next step in a conversation he was only just beginning to understand. He opened his door and walked out into the morning light, his rifle left behind, leaning against the wall inside. He walked to the fence, his steps even and unhurried. The eyes of the tribe followed him, but their gaze felt different now, less like a judgment and more like a simple, powerful act of witness. He reached the fence and looked down at the offering. It was a small pouch made of soft, tanned leather, tied with a sinew cord. Hesitantly, he knelt and reached through the rough-hewn wooden slats of the fence, his fingers brushing against the cool earth before closing around the bundle. It was heavier than it looked. He pulled it back to his side of the fence and stood, holding it in his palm. He looked up, his gaze finding the old man in the crowd. For the first time, their eyes met across the distance. The old man's face was impassive, but his eyes held a depth of expression that was anything but. Elias saw no malice, no threat. He saw something that looked like gratitude. The old man made a slow, deliberate gesture with his hand, a movement that was both a greeting and a sign of peace. Then he gestured toward the bundle in Elias's hand. With trembling fingers, Elias untied the cord. He opened the pouch and tipped its contents into his palm. It was not a weapon. It was not a threat. It was food. Inside were dried strips of meat, a handful of toasted seeds, and 3 small, perfectly formed wild potatoes. It was a gift, an offering, a repayment for the bread he had given the girl. The truth began to dawn on him, not in a sudden flash of insight, but as a slow, painful, and beautiful sunrise in his soul. They were not here for revenge. Their silence had not been a threat. It was something else, something so contrary to his own fears and prejudices that his mind struggled to contain it. He looked from the food in his hand to the faces of the people watching him, and he saw not an enemy, but a reflection of his own forgotten humanity. They were thanking him. The weight of the small leather pouch in his hand was immense, far heavier than its simple contents of dried meat and roots. It was the weight of a truth so profound it threatened to buckle his knees. This silent, days-long ordeal was not a siege. It had been a vigil. The pieces of the puzzle began to click into place, rearranged by this single act of reciprocity. The hunger in the girl's eyes, the bread he had offered, the tribe's sudden, silent appearance, his own paralyzing fear, born of a guilty conscience and a lifetime of inherited prejudice. And now this offering, this gesture of gratitude. It was a story so simple and so human that his own complicated guilt had blinded him to it. He looked toward the line of people, and his eyes searched for the old man again. The elder met his gaze and then made another gesture, this one more complex. He touched his heart, then extended his hand toward the forest, then brought it back to touch his own chest again. It was a simple, eloquent piece of sign language, a story told in a single motion. She who is of my heart was lost, and you returned her to me. As if on cue, a figure emerged from the center of the line of people, guided forward by a woman who was likely her mother. It was the girl. She was no longer the spectral, half-starved creature he had first seen. Her face had filled out, the desperate hollows in her cheeks softened. She was dressed in clean, new deerskin, her hair neatly braided. She was still thin, but she was alive. She was healthy. Her eyes, no longer consumed by a desperate void, met his across the field. They held a shy but clear light of recognition. The truth washed over Elias in a devastating, cleansing wave. The girl must have been sick, delirious with fever and hunger when she stumbled into his clearing. She was lost. In her fevered state, the simple bread he had given her might have been the first food she had kept down in days. It might have been the thing that broke her fever, that gave her the strength to find her way back to her people. To them, it wasn't just a piece of bread. It was medicine. It was a miracle. His simple, thoughtless act of compassion had been interpreted as a powerful intervention. He had not just fed a starving child. In their eyes, he had saved the life of someone precious to them, perhaps the daughter of the elder, the chief. Their silent, unnerving vigil had not been a threat at all. It was a sign of profound respect, an honor guard. They had been protecting the home of the man who had healed their child. They were not surrounding him to take from him. They were surrounding him to honor him. Elias felt a profound and crushing sense of shame for his fear, for his suspicion, for the rifle he had aimed at the old man's heart. He was humbled to the very core of his being. He thought of his wife, Eleanor, dying in his arms in that dark city alley. He thought of the woman he had abandoned at the barricade. For 10 years he had carried the weight of that failure, the belief that he was a man who brought only ruin. And now, through an act he barely remembered, an act born from the ashes of that old guilt, he had been granted an unearned and overwhelming grace. He looked at the girl and then at the food in his hands, and his own eyes filled with tears for the first time in a decade. The sun climbed higher, warming the earth, and the rigid tension that had defined the landscape for days finally dissolved. The silence remained, but its character had changed entirely. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of a threat, but the deep, reverent quiet of a sacred space. Elias stood there, the pouch of food still in his hand, his world completely remade. He was not a prisoner. He was an honored neighbor. He was not a target. He was a healer. He took a slow, deep breath, the air feeling clean and new in his lungs. He looked at the tribe, at the people who had terrified him, and he saw them for the first time, families, elders, children, bound by a love and respect so profound they would stand guard for days to express it. The old man, the chief, took another step forward, beckoning the girl with him. They walked to the fence line. The girl hung back shyly, half hidden behind the elder's leg, but her eyes never left Elias. The chief did not speak in words Elias could understand, but his meaning was clear. He pointed again to the girl, then to his own heart, and then to Elias. There was a debt of honor between them. Elias, feeling a need to respond, to complete the circle of this silent communication, went back inside his cabin. His eyes fell on the rifle, and he felt a fresh wave of shame. He ignored it and went to his meager pantry. He gathered what little he had of value, a full sack of flour, a small tin of precious salt, and the last of his cured tobacco. He brought them out and placed them on the ground by the fence, a humble offering to match theirs. The chief acknowledged the gift with a solemn nod. It was an exchange not of goods but of mutual respect. The transaction was complete. With a final long look at Elias, a look of peace, of understanding, of closure, the chief turned. He said something to his people, his voice low and resonant, the first sound to break the long silence. It was not a command, but a release. As one, the tribe turned and began to walk back toward the forest. They moved with the same quiet grace with which they had arrived, their figures melting back into the shadows of the pines. The mother took the girl's hand. Before she disappeared into the trees, the girl looked back over her shoulder one last time. She gave Elias a small, hesitant smile. It was a gift more valuable than anything they had exchanged. It was absolution. In moments they were gone. The edge of the forest was just the edge of the forest again. The silence that returned was the old silence, the one he had known before. The sound of the wind, the rustle of leaves, the vast empty peace of the plains. But it did not feel empty anymore. It felt full. Elias stood alone in the quiet, the sun warm on his face. The crushing weight he had carried on his soul for 10 years, the burden of his failure and his cowardice, had been lifted. It had not been erased by a grand act of heroism or a desperate plea for forgiveness, but by a simple piece of bread and a silent, reciprocal grace. He had been given a second chance not to be a hero, but simply to be a better man. The land, which had been his penance, now felt like his home. The fence, which had been his prison wall, was now just a boundary. He was no longer a man in exile. He was just a man standing on his own land at peace